The photograph was found inside a cedar chest, sealed with wire and forgotten beneath the attic floorboards of the Dalloway estate. It had survived fire, flood, and the long indifference of a century. When the renovation crew unearthed it, the chest gave off the faint odor of dust and damp earth, like the scent of an opened grave. Inside, beneath stacks of ledgers and a single child's shoe, lay a curled photograph, its corners brittle and flaked. Dust clung to the image in a grey film that dulled the light but could not entirely obscure what it showed. At first glance, it seems an ordinary portrait from another age, a family arranged in careful stillness before a plain studio backdrop, each figure captured in the solemn patience demanded by early photography. The men sit at the center, their mustaches thick and symmetrical, hands resting heavy upon their knees. One holds a child dressed in lace and ribbons, her doll-like expression frozen mid-breath. The women flank them, faces pale and unreadable, dressed in dark, high-collared gowns that press their posture into formality. Behind them, two figures stand, a woman in a grand feathered hat, and a man whose hand rests lightly on the shoulder of one seated below him, a gesture that feels both protective and possessive. The children, small and watchful, stand like echoes of their elders. The girl at the far left, too still for her age. The boy on the right with his hand on a man's shoulder, his stare unwavering, sharp as glass. There is no visible tension, yet something beneath the calm unsettles the air, as though the silence between their breaths lingers longer than it should, and behind their eyes, each of them is waiting for the shutter to release them from the moment they've been held in for far too long. Children linger between them, some perched on low branches above, others leaning against trunks, half hidden by leaves. Their expressions are unguarded, curious, as though caught between play and the solemnity of the moment. In the background, horses stand tethered beside a wooden wagon, half lost in the blur of sun and shadow. The air feels heavy with heat and quiet conversation, the kind that fades when a lens is lifted. And yet, there's something in the stillness that doesn't sit right, a tension beneath the calm. One woman at the edge of the table looks down, her hands clasped too tightly, her face turned away from the light. Another seems to watch her from across the group, eyes narrowed, unreadable. For all its warmth and leisure, the photograph hums with an unseen weight, as though behind the smiles and teacups, something unspoken lingers in the air, waiting to be noticed. No one in the image smiled. That in itself was unremarkable. Long exposures rarely allowed it. But there was something about the boy's stare that seemed different, not frozen by the shutter, but alive within it. His eyes gleamed with a wetness that photography should have erased. The rest of the image, all powdered and distant, seemed to dull around him. Embossed faintly across the bottom of the card were the words, H. Calloway and Sons, Liverpool, 1914. The Dalloways had been a prominent family, owners of textile mills along the River Mersey. The portrait matched the style of families like theirs, the performance of respectability, wealth, and composure. And yet, those eyes, that look. The photograph passed from the builders to the new homeowner, Edith Langley, a retired historian in her late 60s. She specialized in the domestic habits of the Edwardian middle class, their rituals, their architecture of propriety. For her, the past was never something dead. It was an echo that kept whispering. That evening, Edith set the photograph on her desk under the lamplight. It was an object meant to be looked at, and yet, when she leaned closer, it seemed to be the one doing the looking. She studied the faces methodically, taking notes as she always did. The mother's eyes, heavy, perhaps sleepless. The father's pupils, uneven, one slightly dilated, a detail visible only through magnification. The daughter's hands, clasped together, knuckles faintly white. But it was the boy, always the boy, who unsettled her. Beneath the magnifying glass, his features seemed subtly wrong. The lines of his face were too sharp compared to the others, as if he had been exposed longer or caught in movement. His jaw appeared doubled, a faint shadow of itself, as though two mouths occupied the same space at slightly different moments. Behind his ear, the smallest trace of darkness extended into the painted backdrop. Not a smudge, not a flaw, a form, a hand. It hovered inches away, fingers half-curled, reaching not to rest, but to grasp. Edith leaned back, the room suddenly cold. She removed her glasses and rubbed her temples. Light distortion, she told herself, chemical residue. But still she slid the photograph into a drawer and locked it there before leaving her study. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window in pale ribbons, washing the photograph's drawer in quiet gold. Edith unlocked it with a small sense of unease, as though opening something that preferred to stay closed. Over breakfast, she began her research. The Dalloway name appeared often in pre-war records: mill owners, donors, members of the Liverpool Social Register. Henry Dalloway, the patriarch, had chaired a trade committee in 1912. His wife, Margaret, was listed as a benefactor for the Ladies' Benevolent Society. The children were mentioned once, in a charity garden party notice. Eleanor, 8, and Thomas, 4, Dalloway, attendees. Then, abruptly, the paper trail ended. By 1916, the Dalloway name vanished. The only surviving record was a brief obituary in the Liverpool Courier: Henry Dalloway, lost at sea during a transport mission to France. No mention of his wife or children followed. It was as though the rest of the family had dissolved into air. Edith sat back from the archive screen, troubled. Families like the Dalloways did not simply vanish. They lingered in census rolls, probate courts, churchyards. Even ruin left a record. She looked again at the photograph. In daylight, the details seemed clearer, yet colder. The boy's eyes had not lost their luster. If anything, they seemed sharper, the faintest sheen of light pooling in them. She tilted the image to catch the glare, and something new appeared at the bottom of the mount. Faint pencil marks, barely there. She traced them gently with a brush. The graphite caught the light just long enough for the words to emerge. He wouldn't sit still. The letters trembled, as though written by a weary hand. That afternoon, Edith took the photograph to the Liverpool Museum of Photography, where she had once served as a consultant. The curator on duty, Arthur Penbrook, was a careful man who handled objects like eggshells. He placed the print under glass and studied it with professional detachment. "The emulsion's in fair condition," he said after a moment. "No silvering, minimal humidity damage." He leaned closer. "But this, here," he pointed to the blur around the boy's mouth. "That's not aging. That's interference. Someone altered the plate during development. See the way the grain softens? That's not chemical error. It's deliberate." Why would anyone alter a family portrait? Penbrook shrugged. Retouching was common. Some photographers corrected expressions or composure by hand. But this... He hesitated. This looks like they were trying to remove something, or someone. He adjusted the light. And behind the boy's ear, notice that. Those marks. Edith bent closer. There, faint but visible, were 3 slender indentations. Finger marks, she realized, not pressed into the paper, but part of the exposure itself, etched in negative light. "That shouldn't be possible," Penbrook murmured. "You can't photograph a touch unless it existed before the shutter closed." He fell silent, as if afraid of what he'd just said aloud. Edith thanked him and left with the photograph carefully wrapped in tissue. The sky outside had turned the color of old pewter. She felt an inexplicable pull to keep looking at the package under her arm, as though the thing inside had grown aware of being discussed. That night, she dreamed she was standing in a studio. The air reeked of collodion and coal smoke. The Dalloways sat before her, exactly as in the photograph, their faces too still. The backdrop behind them shimmered, revealing chalk outlines, circles and crosses drawn where heads and shoulders should be, marks for posing bodies. "Hold still," a voice whispered, though she couldn't tell whose. The father blinked once, slow and deliberate. The mother's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. The girl's eyes moved towards something outside the frame, and the boy, Thomas, turned his head slightly toward Edith, the motion fluid and precise. His eyes caught hers, and for a heartbeat she felt seen. He blinked once, a long, dragging blink, the shutter of a camera closing. When his lids lifted again, his mouth had opened. A sound followed, faint, rhythmic, a low hum made by a throat unsure how to shape words. She woke, slick with sweat, her heartbeat ticking like a clock that had lost its rhythm. In the stillness of her room, the photograph lay on her desk. She hadn't placed it there. The wrapping tissue was gone. The lamplight struck across its surface, and for an instant, she thought the boy's gaze had shifted slightly toward her. Morning brought no comfort. The light through her window was the color of milk, thin and sickly. She made tea but couldn't drink it. Her hand trembled as she set the cup down. The photograph waited on the desk like a patient thing. She told herself she'd imagined moving it. Sleepwalking, perhaps. Yet, when she looked closer, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A faint crease in the paper, as though it had been gripped between small fingers. The air in the study had changed. It felt closer, denser, charged with the metallic tang of old chemicals. She could almost taste the developing fluid on the back of her tongue. For the first time in her career, Edith considered destroying an artifact. She reached for the matchbox she kept for candles, then stopped. A historian doesn't destroy evidence. Instead, she slipped the photograph into a linen folder, labeled it carefully in her neat script, and placed it in the locked drawer once more. But the mind, once awakened, does not sleep easily. She spent the day combing archives again, tracing the Dalloway name through every available record. In a parish ledger, she found what she hadn't realized she'd been seeking: the baptism of Thomas Henry Dalloway, 1909. The vicar's notes were hurried, the ink fading to rust, mother anxious, child unresponsive to touch, eyes unsteady, possible ailment of the nerves. Weeks later, another line added in darker ink: condition worsened, advised medical evaluation, no follow-up existed. Hours passed unnoticed as Edith scoured old newspapers, chasing the family through rumor and omission. The next reference appeared 3 years later, a brief item buried among society notes. Former nursemaid Agnes Fry has filed charges of mistreatment against her employers, alleging the Dalloway child has been restrained for days at a time due to fits of agitation. The complaint was dismissed, the nurse dismissed soon after. In June 1913, another article: small fire contained in Dalloway nursery. Cause undetermined. Odor of ether reported. Then silence. The Great War arrived, and the Dalloway name ceased to appear altogether. Edith leaned back in her chair, fingers pressed against her eyelids. She could see them now. The mother pacing the halls, the father drinking in the dark, the daughter listening to footsteps that did not belong to the living. And the boy, the restless, sleepless boy. She looked again at the photograph, and though she could not say why, she whispered aloud, "What did they do to you?" The room answered only with its usual creaks, the hum of the old radiator, and, perhaps, the faint echo of a breath drawn too close. That night, the dream returned. Only this time, she wasn't standing before the Dalloways. She was behind the camera. The glass plate gleamed beneath her hands, The smell of ether burned her nose. "Hold still," she said, her voice, and yet not hers. The boy twitched, his head turning fractionally away. Someone behind her muttered. A hand, her hand, reached forward and pressed lightly against his neck. He blinked once, then again, too slow. And then the flash, a white burst that swallowed everything. When she woke, dawn was only a thin seam of light at the curtains. The house was silent. But she knew, before she turned her head, that the photograph would be waiting on the pillow beside her. It was.